On the night of June 5, 1944, one man sat alone and wrote a short letter admitting a defeat that had not yet happened. General Dwight Eisenhower folded the note into his wallet. If the invasion of France failed, he would read it aloud and take the blame himself. It said the landings had failed, that the troops had done all that bravery could do, and that if any blame attached to the attempt, it was his alone. Because what he was about to launch was the largest seaborne invasion in human history, and nobody, not even Eisenhower, knew if it would work. Nearly 7,000 ships, over 11,000 aircraft, 156,000 men, all of it aimed at one fortified coast in one morning. This is the story of D-Day, the lie that hid it, the storm that nearly killed it, and the few blood-soaked hours that cracked open Hitler's Europe. By 1944, Nazi Germany ruled the coast of Western Europe from the edge of the Arctic in Norway all the way to the border of Spain. To keep the Allies out, Hitler ordered the building of the Atlantic Wall, a belt of concrete bunkers, gun batteries, and barbed wire stretching for thousands of miles. The job of finishing it went to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox. He flooded fields, buried mines, and planted the beaches with steel stakes he nicknamed the Devil's Garden. Rommel understood the coming battle better than anyone. The war will be won or lost on the beaches, he warned. The first 24 hours will be decisive. Rommel even had a name for the battle that was coming, one that history would later borrow. He called it simply the longest day. Everyone knew the Allies were coming. The only question was where, and if the Germans guessed right, the invasion would die at the water's edge. So the Allies told an enormous lie. It was called Operation Fortitude, and it may be the greatest military deception ever attempted. They invented an entire army that did not exist, a phantom force of 1 million men poised to strike at the narrowest crossing, the Pas de Calais. In the fields of southeast England, they parked rubber tanks light enough to be lifted by 4 men, plywood planes, and landing craft built of canvas and scaffolding. Fake radio operators filled the airwaves with chatter for units that were only paint and air. To German spy planes overhead, it looked like an army massing for Calais. And to command this ghost army, the Allies picked the one general the Germans feared most, George Patton, and put him in charge of soldiers who weren't there. It worked. Hitler became convinced the true blow would land at Calais, and he held his strongest divisions there, waiting for weeks after the real invasion had begun. The real target was Normandy. The date was set for June 5th, and then the sky turned against them. A savage storm swept into the channel. High winds, low cloud, heavy seas. Landing craft would swamp, paratroopers would scatter, and the bombers would be blind. Everything now hung on one man, a quiet Scottish meteorologist named Group Captain James Stagg. Studying the pressure charts through the night, Stagg saw what almost no one believed, a narrow break in the storm. Roughly 36 hours of just good enough weather, opening on June 6th. It was an agonizing gamble. Go too soon and the storm drowns the fleet. Wait, and the tides and moon would not align again for 2 weeks, long enough for the secret to leak. In a smoke-filled room at 4:15 in the morning, Eisenhower listened, went silent, then gave the order in 3 words. Okay, let's go. It began in darkness. Just after midnight, more than 20,000 American and British paratroopers and glider troops dropped behind the beaches to seize bridges and cut the German roads. But flak and clouds scattered the plains. Men leapt into the wrong fields, miles from their targets. Some, weighed down by 90 pounds of gear, drowned in flooded marshes in the dark. Lost soldiers gathered in the black Normandy hedgerows, clicking small metal crickets to tell friend from enemy, and fought whatever came at them. A few miles inland, British glider troops tried something even more precise. In the black hours before the main assault, they cut loose their tow ropes and silently crash-landed 3 gliders within yards of a key canal bridge. Within minutes, the men of Major John Howard's company had stormed across and seized the bridge intact, the first Allied objective of D-Day, taken before most of the world even knew the invasion had begun. In the town of St. Miraglais, a burning house lit the square as paratroopers drifted straight down into a waiting German garrison. One of them, Private John Steele, snagged his parachute on the church steeple and hung there, wounded in the foot, dangling above the gunfire. For 2 hours he hung limp and played dead, until the Germans finally cut him loose and took him prisoner. He lived, and strangely the chaos helped because even the Germans couldn't tell where the main attack was. As the sun rose, the German defenders looked out at the sea and could not believe what they saw. The horizon was solid with ships, thousands of them, farther than the eye could follow. One German gunner said it looked as if the ocean itself had risen up against them. For the men in the boats, the crossing was its own misery. Packed shoulder to shoulder in pitching landing craft, soaked and violently seasick, some were almost glad when the ramp finally dropped, storm or not. Battleships and cruisers opened fire, hurling shells the weight of small cars into the coastal guns. Then, all along the coast, the ramps began to drop. The Allies struck 5 beaches across 50 miles, each with a code name. Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Gold, Juno, and Sword for the British and Canadians. At Utah, the westernmost beach, the current pushed the boats off course, by sheer luck onto a stretch that was lightly defended. The Americans got ashore there with relatively few losses. Omaha Beach was a slaughter. High bluffs looked straight down on the sand, packed with machine gun nests and artillery. The pre-dawn bombing had missed almost completely, leaving the defenses intact. When the ramps dropped, the German gunners were ready. Entire boatloads of men were cut down before they could take a single step. The lucky ones rolled over the sides into water above their heads. The survivors crawled forward across 200 yards of open sand covered with the dead and the wounded, past wire and obstacles, toward the only cover, a low stone seawall. For hours, Omaha hung by a thread. Generals watching offshore thought about giving it up. But in ones and twos, led by sergeants and junior officers, small groups clawed up the bluffs and knocked out the guns from behind. By afternoon, at a cost of more than 2,000 men on that one beach, the Americans held Omaha. Between the two American beaches rose a 100-foot cliff called Point du Hoc, crowned with heavy guns that could shell both landings at once. 225 U.S. Army Rangers were handed an impossible order: land at the base and climb the sheer cliff under fire, with ropes and grappling hooks. German soldiers leaned over the edge, cutting the ropes and dropping grenades. The Rangers climbed anyway, hand over hand, up the wet rock. They reached the top and found the great guns gone, pulled back inland by the Germans. So the Rangers pushed on, hunted them down in an orchard, and blew them apart. Then they held that ground for 2 brutal days against counterattack after counterattack. Of the 225 who climbed, only about 90 could still fight at the end. The Germans could still have thrown the whole invasion back into the sea if they had struck fast. They did not. Rommel, certain the weather made a landing impossible, had driven home to Germany for his wife's birthday. The commander of the coast was hundreds of miles away when it began. The powerful panzer divisions that might have crushed the beachhead sat idle. Only Hitler could release them, and Hitler was asleep, and his staff were too frightened to wake him. By the time the tanks were finally freed, precious hours were gone, and Allied fighter bombers ruled the sky, smashing anything that moved on the roads to the coast. By the end of the longest day, all 5 beaches were taken. More than 150,000 men stood ashore in occupied France. The price was staggering. Around 4,500 Allied soldiers were killed on D-Day alone, more than 2,000 of them on the sand at Omaha. And the fight was far from over. Beyond the beaches waited the blockade, ancient hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress, and weeks of savage, close-range killing. But the door was open. Once the Allies were ashore and could not be pushed back, the war in the West became, in the end, only a question of time. Rommel had been right about one thing. The first 24 hours decided everything. They had simply not gone his way. The men who fell on that coast bought a foothold on a continent with their lives. It is why, all these years later, we still know the names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. Next time, we leave the beaches of Europe for the wide Pacific, and a battle decided not in hours, but in 5 unbelievable minutes. Midway.